As children's ministry leaders, we love God, we love children, and we love the gospel. And our primary reason for doing ministry is to share the gospel with children in ways that transform their lives. We want to see children everywhere following Jesus. But in our eagerness to help children follow Jesus, we aren't always as careful as we should be or we need to be about how we share the gospel with children. We're going to think deeply and ask some difficult questions about the ethics involved in sharing the gospel with children. As we begin, let me share a story of a European outreach event. Perhaps you've encountered events similar to it. This ministry organization decided that they wanted to make an impact in the community. They wanted to see children in their community come to faith. They talked about the best way to do it, and they decided that sports would be a good avenue for ministry. They gathered together some quality coaches. They decided that they would do a 2-hour format on a Saturday morning. And in the middle of the 2-hour format, they would set about a half-hour aside for some religious instruction. They did a great job of advertising. They advertised on the local radio stations. They advertised in the local schools. They sent flyers around the neighborhood. The children flocked to their program. It was very, very successful until some of the parents started to ask questions about this religious instruction. They felt that they hadn't really been consulted. And some of them began to push back on this ministry because of the religious instruction component. The parents said they hadn't signed off on it. How do you feel about this outreach event? On one level, it was very successful. There were a lot of children. The children were engaged, children who would otherwise never have come to a ministry event. But there were also parents who were unhappy. I wonder if you feel that outreach event was a success or not. Would you have done things that way? You know, it's interesting to think about this outreach event because I imagine you assumed that the outreach event was a Christian outreach event. In actual fact, it wasn't. It was a Muslim outreach event with European children whose families were either of no faith or of Christian faith. The parents were very upset. You know, sometimes we think about outreach with children and the only way we think about it is through our own lens. But when we step into the shoes of parents who care deeply about their children, who want to oversee the teaching of their children, we recognize that most parents care deeply about their children and that they feel a responsibility for what their children are being taught. This event raised a lot of ethical questions. Is it right to share the gospel with children? When we put ourselves in the shoes of the parents, we recognize there's some harder questions. Let me say first of all that the question matters a lot. When we think about children in our world, we recognize that most children in our world are not Christians. They come from families of no faith or of other faiths. In fact, statistics tell us that only 1 in 3 children in the world comes from a family who identify themselves as Christian. The other 7 children have parents of no faith or of other faiths. Within those 3 children, many of those families are not involved in any meaningful way with church. They don't have a personal relationship with Jesus, and they're not sharing the gospel or the good news of Jesus with their children. I don't know what official statistics say, but my estimate is that at best, 1 in 10 children have a family who can introduce them to Jesus. For 9 out of 10 children in our world, or possibly more, it will take somebody outside of their family to tell them the good news of the gospel. But how do we do that? Should we do that? Jesus is very clear. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus tells a story about children. It's the story of the lost sheep. I don't know if you ever realized that story was about children. But Jesus tells the story of the shepherd who pursued the sheep, regardless of the cost to himself. He pursued the sheep. His heart was that every single one would have an opportunity to be in the fold. The Father's heart was for every child. How would the Father feel as he looks at our world and realizes that 90 out of 100 sheep or more are outside the fold? The Father says, "Your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost." I believe that God wants us to share Jesus with children. Our experience also suggests that it's important for us to share Jesus with children. When you think about when you first heard the gospel, I'm assuming that for most of you, you were a child. For most people in our world, they hear the gospel and choose to follow Jesus as children. If we're not ministering to children, we're missing the best opportunity for children everywhere to follow Jesus. As people who love Jesus and love children and love the gospel, we're eager to share the gospel with children. But Dan Brewster suggests that we need to be careful in how we do that. He writes, "In ministry with children, we must always be particularly sensitive to the proper time, place, manner, and approach for overt evangelism. Inattentiveness to the situation and circumstances may make overt evangelism in that time, place, and manner insensitive or even unethical." Brewster isn't saying that it's not ethical to share the gospel with children, but he is cautioning us that the way we do it may at times be unethical. He goes on to share several guidelines to consider as we approach evangelism with children. First, he says that children should not be subjected to religious teaching without the knowledge and consent of their parents. Parents in most areas want their children to flourish. They want what's best for their children. They want to know what their children are being taught. It's important that they are part of our projects. Secondly, Brewster suggests that Christians should not pressure children for conversion in situations where the children or their families are completely dependent on the financial support of Christians. In no way do we want to tie a child's acceptance of the gospel to the provision of their physical needs. They're two separate things. We need to be very careful. Brewster goes on to suggest that it's improper to seek the conversion of children with a patronizing attitude that distances oneself from the painful reality they may be facing. The gospel is good news for children, but sometimes the way we present it suggests that the gospel will fix all of their problems. Ultimately, Jesus has won the battle, but for many of our children, they may choose to follow Jesus and go back to a very difficult reality. I spent time with a friend, Maria, who works in the slums of a city in Brazil. She shared a story of a young man who came to camp. He was 15 years old, and he was deeply involved in the gang culture of his city. They learned that he had already murdered 3 times. That week at camp, he met Jesus. Jesus made a difference in his life, and he chose to be a follower of Jesus. He went to Maria and asked, what do I do now? Maria was very, very honest with him. She didn't pretend that Jesus would change everything about the reality of his situation. She told him, when you go back, you will probably be killed. But Jesus is with you, and he loves you, and he will be with you no matter what. That was an example of sharing the gospel in a way that was truthful, in a way that did not distance herself from the reality of this boy's life. I saw Maria a year later, and I asked her, what happened? How is he doing? Is he okay? She went on to share, he's doing well. He got arrested, he's in prison, and he's safe now, and he's telling people about Jesus. The gospel is good news, but it doesn't always fix our problems. We need to be truthful as we share the gospel with children. Brewster also suggests that it may be improper, it may be unethical to guide children to become Christians when they don't have a proper understanding of what that may entail. In many places in the world, there's persecution that follows a decision to follow Jesus. Do our children who are choosing to follow Jesus understand the cost? I remember a friend telling me about a camp. It was a camp in a Western country, but there was a young Pakistani girl who came to camp. She heard about Jesus and she wanted to become a follower of Jesus. Her camp counselor gave her good advice. It was advice that we often give children when they choose to follow Jesus. At least it sounded like good advice. Her camp counselor suggested that when she go home, she tell her family about her decision to follow Jesus. It wasn't good advice in that situation. When the girl went home, she shared her decision to follow Jesus with her family. Within just a few weeks, the girl was sent back to Pakistan and married to a much older man to keep her safe from Christian influence that she had been exposed to. There was an enormous cost for that girl that she hadn't had a chance to consider, and neither had her camp counselor. When we think about the gospel, we believe that the gospel is the power of God to salvation. We believe that the gospel is truly good news for children. But how we share the gospel with children needs to be careful. We must consider the hard ethical questions before we jump in with both feet and potentially cause children to make decisions that they haven't counted the cost for. So the gospel is good news. We love the gospel, we love children, we love Jesus, but we also need to be careful.